how that's going to impact. So what we're doing, the next 5 slides are going to very quickly explore the impact on gig-only workers on the national retirement income adequacy measures. I'm not looking only at the gig workers themselves. What I'm trying to focus on is, given these various assumptions, given this different sensitivity analysis on what might happen with gigs going forward, or basically what is currently happening with them in terms of access or generosity of employer-provided provisions, how is that going to impact the overall national retirement income? One of the things we'll have in the full report is obviously, and this is going to wait till the BLS report is released next week, is what does the gig worker retirement income adequacy look like? So very quickly, I'm going to give you 5 slides. The first one is going to vary the probability that gig workers have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans. The second one is going to vary the total contribution rate for gig workers, which is trying to get at that fundamental question, are they having benefits as generous as the non-gig workers if they do have employer-sponsored retirement plan? Then I'm going to do 3 different slides looking at the probability of being a gig worker. Everybody, well, many people say that probability is going to increase in the future. How much of an impact that's going to have? The first one is going to assume that you have a total contribution rate exactly equal to traditional workers. The second one will take half of that. And the third one will assume the probability of being a gig worker doubles, but you don't have any access if you're a gig worker. So that last one is going to be, in essence, the worst case scenario I'm going to show you today. Okay, so if the first one, and I break this out by age, as you would expect, you're always going to see the biggest impact for the youngest cohorts. So the only thing I'm going to focus on in these 5 slides is the youngest cohort. We go 35 to 39 for our youngest cohort. And what I'm showing you in the red line, if I assume this access to employer-sponsored retirement plans for gig-only worker is a function of age and income, then I'm showing that compared to my overall baseline, where before we went back and flagged the gig workers, etc., there's about a 4% drop in this net retirement savings surplus. And again, remember that net retirement savings surplus is just the present value of all surpluses at the end of life minus the present value of all deficits individuals have who do run short of money. Now, if I change that from the baseline assumptions to assuming no gig workers have access, you see for the youngest workers that changes from a 4% decrease in NRSS to a 7% decrease. So there's a little bit of an impact there. The next slide looks at the impact of the total contribution rate for gig workers. Either this is a function of employers offering less generous matches or employees not making the same level of contribution, everything else equal. And if you look at that top line, the blue line of 100%, that's just the same line we had on the previous graph of a 4% drop. If you say, well, maybe it's more likely that they're only having a total contribution rate half of what the traditional workers have, given the same age and income, then you have a deficit that increases to 5.6%. If you want to take this even further for the younger workers and say, no, let's assume that they're only getting 25% of a total contribution rate vis-a-vis their traditional workers, then that deficit then the NRSS ends up decreasing by 6.3% instead. Okay, now what about the probability of a gig worker? I could have done many different paths going forward. I got really lazy and say, let's just assume it doubles overnight. So we have some kind of way of benchmarking this. If you think it's going to phase out over time, or phase in over time, just give me your assumptions. I'll be more than happy to run those. But again, under the current, the blue line, which you saw on the first graph of a 4% decrease, if the probability of being a gig worker doubles immediately, then the decrease in the net retirement savings surpluses basically goes more than twice of what we currently have to 8.9%. But that assumes that if you have access, you have the same contribution rate that you would have if you were a traditional worker. If you don't buy into that, then we go to the next one and say, well, what if the probability doubles, but if you do have access, your total contribution rate is only half of what it would have been if you were a traditional worker. Then we go from the 5.6% we saw on the previous graph to 11.8%. So now we're saying from an overall standpoint, these individuals, by the time they get to the end of their life, will have nearly 12% less in terms of a surplus than they would have had it not been for the gig economy. And finally, my worst case scenario, I double the probability immediately, and there is no access to employer-sponsored retirement plans for gig workers. In that case, it goes from the 7% we saw earlier all the way to 14.5%. So in the worst case scenario, we're seeing for the youngest workers almost a 15% drop in the national retirement income adequacy numbers. So what can we put together from all this as far as takeaways? At least what we've seen today, the potential impact of the gig-only economy on national retirement income adequacy is going to depend on several factors. The ones we showed you today, certainly the percentage of the workforce in the gig-only economy, the percentage of gig-only workers who have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans, and the relative generosity of the employer-sponsored retirement plans for gig-only workers relative to traditional workers. Now, we showed you a lot of percentages, didn't want to bog you down in numbers, but if you convert these to numbers, the potential dollar value of this is truly significant. In the worst case scenario I showed you, the one at the very end where we came up with that 14.5% decrease for the youngest workers, in the worst case scenario presented today, we have a decrease in the NRSS, that number I gave you in the beginning, equal to $2.2 trillion in 2018 dollars. So I take the present value from when they die, bring everything back to 2018. It's a decrease of 2.2 if probability doubles and there is no access to employer-sponsored retirement plans. If you want to look only at those who basically run short of money, it's a much smaller number, and our increase in what we call retirement savings shortfalls is about $61 billion in 2018 dollars. So I will leave it to the others to discuss basically how we try to fix this. But in terms of how big a potential problem this is going to be for national retirement income adequacy, depends on your assumptions, but certainly in the worst case scenario, the importance of a gig-only economy on national retirement income adequacy is going to be very, very large. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to turn it to Julie and then Ken.